Thank you very much, everybody, for being here this afternoon. So I'm Louise Lemyre from the University of Ottawa, and I'm in the room with Beaudry. So today we'll be presenting the result of our second grant-in contribution agreement of a 3-year project funded by Environment and Climate Change Canada. So first, I want to acknowledge and thank ECCC for the financial support, but especially for the interest and enthusiasm of the people working there, and more specifically even with the group in Kelowna and Montreal, who've shown really great interest and have been feeding us with real input on the topic, as well as a group in Montreal related to the university, UQAM, on the communication side, as well as the summer school led by Philippe Gachon, to which we participated. So today, therefore, this work was building on a 1-year first grant where we established how much risk perception does drive behaviors that are necessary to respond to risk communication about weather events. And those actions, therefore, depends on the way people perceive those risks, which is how they understand them and what they feel about them, and therefore it will change sort of what the message has to have in terms of content, and that those things happen at 2 levels in particular, the individual one, for sure, especially in the public, but as well at the collective level in the partnership with organizations, so either the clients or other stakeholders of weather response, or now about climate change mitigation, for example, or adaptation. So risk management requires action, but for that it requires anticipation and planning, and for those risk communication is sort of the substance driver underneath that. All of this, therefore, needs risk communication. So the project goal of that 3-year project was to assist Environment and Climate Change Canada in testing risk perception, some specifics to what is currently or was currently happening at the time, reframing the risk communication enterprise in a way about extreme weather events with the aim to improve preparedness at both the individual and the organizational levels by fostering mobilization, empowerment, and collaboration. So today I'll be presenting the essence of the report that I think has been disseminated a little bit within the department. So the first component is about the conceptual basis and the framework overall. How do we situate the risk perception and risk communication in the work that is being done by the department? Describe 4 specific empirical studies that had really to sort of bring new data really directly applied to the type of work you're doing, then derive some interpretation and implication for that, and indicate then future directions or how we are pursuing our research right now, both in terms of the public perception, but as well in terms of inter-organizational collaboration, especially in the context of the Sendai framework or the platform on overall risk reduction, and namely linked to climate change currently. So the first part of the report is therefore on the basic model or conceptualization of risk perception and risk communication, what we call the psychosocial aspects, in that it relates to how we think, how we feel, and how we behave at the bottom line. So you're certainly familiar with sort of the classic definition of risk being the probability of a hazard times the probability of consequences. Usually as experts, especially in meteorology or climatology or in public health actually, most experts specialize on the characterization of the hazards. So in this picture, so traditionally it's on the situation or the hazard. We see a little bit of the effect. Often it's in terms of mortality and then some mitigation in terms of intervention. What we are developing and fostering is to combine that and articulate better the link with the psychosocial component, which is how it impacts on populations that themselves have to be characterized because they're not homogeneous. They're different levels and different segments. What are the effects for them? So characterize better the various consequences and then the possible actions that they may take or not. So it is the dotted rectangle that we will be emphasizing in this report. At the core of that, therefore, is the idea that the two types of preoccupations of consideration are essential, and to reconcile them. So often we hear, especially from experts and in academia as well, oh, people don't understand. If only the public was listening or obeying better, or they're distorting. What we're arguing is that it's not really a distortion per se. It's not that they don't get it. It's that they put the emphasis on different factors or considerations than experts do. Experts analyze the risk assessment part in terms more of the hazard compared to the public that is much more worried about the consequences it may have on them. And as well, experts are there a lot driven by the probability of something occurring and modeling that, whereas the public is about the meaning it has to things that they do value and care about. So if we were better at maintaining the parallel, but reconciling the fact that risk assessment is the equivalent of risk perception, but in a different matrix, that threshold that we establish as experts correspond to risk acceptability in terms of what's the threshold for action or not and the tolerance to those hazards, and that risk management, which is planning of risk mitigation mostly for experts, the equivalent is to change the behaviors about risk in the general public. So when you see those two streams as complementary rather than fighting to impose one over the other, then I think it gets better in terms of the richness of them and the efficacy of the messages that we convey in risk communication. And the other layer to this is to the conceptual framework is to remind ourselves that we live in a social ecology of risk and of context, where, as you see here on the picture, certainly at the bottom, the individual with its education, income, resources, and past experience is certainly one of the important layers, but that is nested in their microsystem of family and friends that will have a lot of influence in filtering the messaging and for whom they'll be deciding on their behaviors. This is situated then in the mesosystem relating to neighborhood, community, and the specificities of the environment in which they live, which itself is governed under government, media, the services that are available, and a general, much more global context of the institutions in Canada, so how we relate to the expertise and authority of our government, as well as some cultural aspects linked to that will differentiate us from Europe, France in particular, or to the United States. All of those influences are filtered, as you can see sort of in the disc, intra-individual in terms of how we appraise risk, in terms of what we call cognitions, which touch on the beliefs we have about the weather, our perception of what's going on, and our understanding of what is happening and what we can do about it. And that is also filtered at the individual level in terms of the behaviors, what will trigger them, what are the levers, in which setting are we, depending on what we can do and not do to mitigate the risk. And that will finally, therefore, impact individual preparedness, but as well the collective one, either at the community level with the municipal services or collective in terms of other departments or other clients or major infrastructure players in our surroundings. So that's sort of like a second pillar of our framework. And the third important consideration conceptually is to remind ourselves that communication is not just a point in time. Communication is within a timeline where usually either in disaster, I worked also a lot in terrorism and or emergencies, we're usually very focused at T0, at time of impact, and a little bit -1 just before to try to get sort of emergency services ready to do that. But much before the impact, that's when sort of the core information and most importantly, the trust that we will want to play on. Trust is not just are we accurate or not. It's a leap of faith that the relationship we have established means that we'll follow your recommendations when T0 occur and we don't have much time for explanation. So the timeline is really related to the relationship of building trust and understanding beforehand so that communication is actually an exchange and not just a push of information. It's establishing a relationship, and we're aiming for sustainable communication, not just sustainable environment, if I may play on the terms here. So that really gives us that actually risk perception gives us a window on some levers to improve response and preparedness to extreme weather events by better understanding the difference between the public risk perception and the expert one, and seeing that the two are legitimate in their own world, if I may say, because we prioritize different evaluative dimensions, and that therefore the role is not for experts just to estimate accurately and characterize accurately the hazard. In a way, it's extending a little bit the mandate to say that the responsibility is in translating that information in a way that the audience can understand it and use it. So it is a little bit pushing sort of the envelope, if we can say, on that stuff. Based on basic psychosocial aspects, such as the cognitive and affective appraisal of risk, so how much what we value will have more importance. So for the public, it's more important to know whether their basement or will be flooded or not, if they'll lose their pictures and important papers, more than the number of centimeters of snow or millimeters of rain that will occur. So there are better ways to convey that message. Heuristics refer to the way any human being understand and can play rapidly with numbers and what probabilities mean. And other words in cognitive psychology show, for example, that we do not have a linear mental representation of probabilities. It's sort of like our mind can handle very small one and very big one, but 90% is not 9 times more than 10%. It's lots or little. And so that has some implication in the way we communicate. That reflects the mental model, so the way we represent how things occur. And the social aspect of communication that is critical, which is, do you trust the source of the messaging? Do you believe in its ethics and its benevolence? And that will be critical, especially as you have to convey uncertainty, and even more uncertainty earlier in the timeline. So using those 3 aspects can help to convey the impact and the role of uncertainty as a good resource rather than being almost an error or a mistake, as too often is being characterized, especially by the media. So the 3 main lessons coming from risk perception, from previous work we have and from the literature, is that actually the public does differentiate between probability and severity, and that can be a big ally. So they know when things are important because they occur frequently, or they're important because that's going to be catastrophic. And usually it has been more described as oh, people don't understand and we should have only one code. There's no evidence to support that, really. The second is that for taking action, the sense of control and mastery is critical. And for that, it means that we have to empower people or give them examples of how they can have the skills or the behaviors to change something in the outcome, in the consequences. And finally, it's the role of uncertainty. We'll come back to it a little bit later, that it's more than a margin of error. It's more than a lack of knowledge most of the time. And if we can convey that, they can rely on the fact that we will convey the information and correct it as it gets to be known, and it can empower them. And we say it earlier with uncertainty because we prefer that they prepare and have time before, then that can be very positive and actually the messaging having more traction. And that's basically the role of trust. So now I'll present some of the actual evidence that we've gathered under this grant and contribution, because we've done empirical research testing message content about the role of hazard, the role of consequences, and the role of action on both perception and preparedness. So, for example, in a series of studies we've done, the design was, for those who may be familiar, what we call a 2x3x2. So for two types of events, extreme heat and flooding, which was sort of the two conditions that seemed to be more consensual as a problem for Environment Canada and that are represented across the country. We designed on computer tasks two different types of vignettes where we were manipulating the message in terms of its content for information types, so either giving baseline neutral information as a control, or describing the hazard, or describing the consequences. As well, we implemented either a portion of the message centered on an action that was appropriate preparedness or a neutral message. You have it at the bottom of that slide sort of the more systematic way that we were actually implementing all those changes, and we did that as well, choice of language in French and in English to different groups of participants, and with their full content, obviously, because that's research ethics, so that was done in that setting. In a nutshell, sort of the results you have on this slide here is on the risk perception, and you have it for flash floods and for heat waves, where you see that when indeed we present characterization of the hazard, there's a higher point in terms of perception. So it does work to raise attention about risk perception of extreme events, and that's different than if there was no information on the hazard. So indeed it works. You see more risk if a hazard is raised, but the critical point is not so much the risk perception as the preparedness. And that's what our studies showed, that a number of studies are not asking, but it's to see what's the impact of having that information. And on those two graphs here, one for flash flood, one for heat waves, there are two important messages in those. The first one is that it shows that the information on consequences actually does raise as well the preparedness as much as on the hazard. But if there's an action message that is giving some tips on what to do and what it could mean for the person, you see that the gap between the blue line and the green line indicates how much the green line is always higher steadily. So as soon as you have a component of action that empowers, habilitates the person what to do, that they should change the decision, it is much more effective to increase preparedness. And that's an important message because even in the medical world, we're now realizing that there's a lot of messages out there that increase risk perception for cancer, for heart attacks, for sexual diseases, but they don't change behaviors unless you show some or point to some behaviors that would empower people to minimize their risk towards that. So that's an important component. If we aim for preparedness, we don't aim for only risk perception. The second part of the research that we're empirically testing is about the terminology that is or was used by Environment and Climate Change Canada, testing the gradation because the system is quite built around the idea of advisory, warning, watch, anchors, and the differences in languages. So using the same type of design that we had before, we compared if the messages were explicitly targeting a watch, a warning, or an advisory of either heat wave or flooding. As you can see on the graph overall, across the different type of anchors, for Canadians, there's no difference. So as experts, you may say, you may think that because it was very important, you rushed to develop a warning. But for the receiving audience, it's just like about the same as usual. So those three anchors do not seem to work. Actually, even for the French, which is the blue line below, you see that it even had a counterproductive use with the translation they. It seems that, and then we did some qualitative work after we had those responses. They in French means Eve. So for people, it was not like you should watch, but it's an eve of, like Christmas Eve, like New Year's Eve, which means we are the day before. If there's a snowstorm, we're the day before. Let's take the road and go to our party or our event. So actually, it was reducing their vigilance and their preparedness towards the event. So it's because the word watch and warning are used in many other contexts. We have watch will often be, oh, watch this on TV. So the sense that is being used by Environment Canada is not shared in the context of all the other communication that are being used. Whereas warning, because it's a liability disclaimer, we have warning on our seatbelt, on our toys, everywhere else. And so in many contexts, warning means just, oh, okay, we don't want to be sued. So therefore, there would be some work possibly to improve the efficacy of those anchors. We thought that maybe being inspired a little bit about what is being done by Météo France with the Vigilance system, which is color-coded, and the maps are either green, yellow, orange, or red, or inspired as well because the state has a color system. As well, it has been used a little bit in the terrorism sector, and I could discuss long, sort of, it was not very effective in that context, but we also did work to test if we could improve the alert terminology by pairing it with color, and then with, as well, come back with our message about consequences. You'll see here that in color, in English, the first graph, it did not make much of a difference because the anchors were still, we could not like undo the non-effect of the anchors. And in French, it gave really mixed results. So it worked well to differentiate watch versus warning. So people got it that, oh, if it's orange, it's worse than yellow. But not watch and advisory. So mixed results using both color and anchors. However, when the messages had a consequence built in the message, and as you can see on this graph where the purple line is above the gray one, it means that when there were a bit of information on consequence, all of the anchors work better in terms of the vigilance score, and especially when we wanted it in terms of the warning and the, above and beyond, that's when you would want most people to actually be vigilant about it. So that was sort of the core result for the reaction with the public, that side of communication. But as well, a big mandate of Environment and Climate Change Canada is to work with partners. It could be clients, but more and more, and especially in terms of the new platform for risk reduction, with other departments that have a mandate that is linked to consequences. And are there ways to improve the communication in those contexts? So we use a design we had used previously in response to terrorism preparedness to test communication in between professionals. So we called it an in vivo simulation, and we grouped in a room 3 people from different backgrounds of professionals. So in that case, so some were more public safety, military, or police officers, sorry for the accent, people from public health, emergency responders, and some NGOs as well, with a video conference system and a scenario. And in some conditions, they're all of the same type, like 3 military or 3 paramedics together, or mixed team. But that's the mixed one we're most interested in this context. And they had 2 tasks, one to do a public message and the other to do a message about worker safety priorities. And we observed their communication behaviors. We asked them for their subjective reports, and we rated also their performance on the task. Some of the results here is the satisfaction with the outcomes. So in dark green, you have people who were satisfied, who were pleased with their encounter, and those who were less happy, less satisfied. And one of the critical elements was whether they had asked a lot of questions to the other type of person, and as well, and here a little bit reversely, if they had checked the understanding of people. Here I will redifferentiate those results, because oftentimes we take what satisfaction from a meeting means in comparison to the actual performance in that meeting. And on the performance measures, you can see here that those who performed better were the ones that did check regularly the understanding of the other parties, and that made explicit agreement statement of, okay, so we agree that this is what we should do, and then they would move on. So there were explicit steps in the type of relationship. Those behaviors are fairly specific. They have the advantage of being teachable, trainable. We just need to be more aware of them. And they are different if we work within our organization than if we work in interprofessional environments. So it's not the same behaviors that seem to lead to the same satisfaction nor to the same performance. And that's the research we want to pursue. So in summary, for the evidence that we have developed is the idea that is the results that describing the hazard is effective to increase risk perception, but the consequences are better to increase preparedness, and describing some adaptive actions increases the preparedness more and empowers people to sort of connect the dots that they should do something about it. The message is that watch and warning are not differentiated, and that's not a very useful way to disseminate our information, and especially in French. It has different cultural meaning. Coupling anchors and color helps a bit, but there gives more mixed results. certainly more effective is, again, to bring the consequences into the messages. About the interprofessional teams, the communication there is that checking explicitly the understanding is a good way to improve the team performance. The explicit agreement statements relates also to improve performance. And asking questions is good to improve satisfaction. But that's an example where checking the understanding within an organization seems to augment frustration because you're sort of like double guessing people whom you think should know that you know. So internally, it's not very good to do, but when you're in an external context, that's something to promote. And that actually, one of the big message also is that from a questionnaire, frustration and differences of opinion, which if you've experienced working with others at time, you probably can relate to some experiences where you were very frustrated. Well, it does not relate to performance, nor to the trust that you will have in some people. The trust is more related to the level of engagement, of participation in the discussion, and that's why asking questions seems to promote trust in the other stakeholders with whom you're working. Therefore, all of that sort of helped us to improve the framework, to put more emphasis on population and on impact, i.e. on the people and the consequences, and a little bit turn around the paradigm that we had at the beginning, and to differentiate more in terms of populations have subgroups into them and different segments, and effects also have different layers. Here they're called Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, which is used in other public safety contexts to say Tier 1 is the direct damage, being hurt or losing one's house. Tier 2 is the impact on the infrastructure and the services, like no electricity, or the schools will be closed, or the hospital don't go to emergency rooms. And Tier 3 is how much the impact has challenged, like the trust in the government or in sort of the safety of the country. So better articulating all those levels of intervention in the messages, and also describing more different type of interventions that can be at a small level or a big level. All of that have also to be multifactorial. So that's what we want to promote and to push in terms of a new emphasis, which of course doesn't minimize the fact that we still need to know the science about the hazard, the situation, and how it will influx on the other part of it. That brings us to the future, the continuation of that research. One part is to continue with the public understanding of risk. And we've been conducting in our lab sort of a national representative survey of risk perception across domain, health risk in particular, and more recently environmental risk. And in the next edition, we would like to add climate change risk to better understand risk perception, how they link to preparedness and to adaptation, what are the bits of information that are the most critical, but also with the work of Miriam in her doctoral thesis on inter-organizational collaboration, which is essential for disaster risk reduction planning. And she'll be describing those aspects of what Canada needs to know and understand. Miriam?
Hello, everybody. So, as Louise has said, my name is Miriam Beaudry, and I'm very happy to be here today to discuss our future work that we'll be conducting as part of my doctoral thesis research. So, as we have been discussing, natural disasters are very complex problems, and they require collaboration across traditional boundaries, such as levels of government, sectors of activity, and professional fields. And so, fulfilling disaster risk reduction mandates requires collaboration between heterogeneous stakeholders, and this translates into communication between people with possibly very different views of disasters, of possible solutions, and of the best ways to collaborate. And so, therefore, this entails managing issues of trust, of frustration, and of uncertainty. So the research that we're conducting is in social and organizational psychology to try to understand better the challenges that this interprofessional or that this type of collaboration entails, and to develop training and tools that can help professionals collaborate effectively in that context. So what previous research suggests is that in interprofessional settings where you have different views, first, this can have either a positive or a negative impact on the quality of decision-making. So positive, when people are able to integrate their expertise and therefore arrive at a deeper understanding of the problem and thus at better decision-making. But negative if people are stalled by misunderstandings or disagreement, that they don't have the tools to integrate effectively. And for the development of collaborative relationships, so to refer back to what Louise was discussing as sustainable communication and sustainable collaboration, where you can apply what you learn on the long term to become more effective as the collaboration develops. So the presence of different views can have either a neutral effect or a negative effect on relationship development. So for example, when conflicts between ideas develop into conflicts between people or organizations. So the next question is, what can facilitate successful collaboration in an interprofessional context? And one element that can play a role is the level of mutual understanding between the different professionals. So they might have different views of the problems or of the sources, the drivers of the risks, but if they understand each other's perspectives, then that's a first step in trying to integrate them together to come at better decisions. And so how can we develop mutual understanding? So one possible way is through specific group communication behaviors that could facilitate that the professional learns more about their perspectives. So based on this model, in my doctoral thesis research, we're proposing 3 studies. The first one is going to be an interview-based studies where we'll be trying to document the representations or how federal departments with disaster risk reduction mandates see disaster risk reduction planning and collaboration. So how in different federal departments we might have different or similar converging or diverging views of disaster risk reduction. The second study will be pursuing the analysis of the group communication behaviors that Louise has discussed to better understand the drivers of successful collaboration in interprofessional settings, more particularly. And third, we'll be developing and testing a training intervention that is aimed at supporting effective interorganizational disaster risk reduction planning. So these are the studies that are proposed in the context where, because of the complexity of the issues of disaster risk reduction, collaboration is required, but collaboration is in and of itself a complex endeavor, especially in interprofessional settings. And so professionals can be given tools and strategies that they can use to maximize their ability to integrate their expertise with the knowledge and expertise of other experts and professionals. And so therefore ensuring that their expertise can effectively support planning and decision-making, especially in disaster risk reduction. So we'll be developing tools, hopefully, and training to support that. So I'm just going to pass the mic back to Louise. Thank you.
So in summary, our project aimed to increase the understanding on how individuals and stakeholders form their risk perception and then move into an intent to prepare for severe weather events. It tested ways to improve the efficacy of those messages. It proposed sort of a renewed framework, revisited, and it suggested ways to better address risk with the public and with the partners in a timeline of communication and of collaboration. So we produced 5 studies in this context, and we had other work as well as background information that showed that really proposing to push further appropriate actions that empower and enable people to themselves mitigate part of the risk, notwithstanding that there still need to be an organized state response or authority-based, describing more consequences, so translating the characterization of hazard in things that people can visualize, supporting as well how color can help to do it, differentiating target audience, and maybe that's good to say as well. Some people might, I've seen the other co-author, my other doctoral student who just defended, Dr. Yong, who work with on the risk perception and preparedness of immigrant populations in Canada. And so there are some differences in what are the dimensions that are more critical, and as well how that develops in time, and the importance of testing messages, not just internally before we send them, but with the segmented audiences that we need to. And the future directions, therefore, is to continue, I think, to invest in investigating how the federal effort into risk reduction should facilitate collaboration between, especially public health, public safety, and the expertise that forecasting meteorological and climatic information can provide, and to test that in training that can foster those relationships in an efficient, mobile, and easy way, such as webinars like we're doing right now, for example. So you have some of the information and some of the other background, more specialized, published, peer-reviewed publications of our work on our GAPSanté website under publication. We also have a YouTube channel for which likely we will have a copy of the video for those who would not be from Environment Canada and do not have access to the link where it will be posted. So we are happy to post it as well if you want to share it. And some of the more easy or amenable for non-specialists reading on what we presented today is part of a book we collaborated to with the Montreal team on communication of meteorological and climatic risks, which was also sponsored by Environment and Climate Change Canada. And you have the reference here. It's even available on Amazon.com or .ca. As well, for those who are interested in the topic, who have perspectives, who want to contribute to it, I invite you to write to me at the email address, because we'll be looking for volunteers to support to participate in the interviews that Miriam will be doing, as well as to pilot the training that we want to develop. So we encourage you to let us know of your interest. Thank you very much, and we can continue now with some questions, but I'll let Kirk sort of drive the WebEx from now on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Really appreciate the insight and thought-provoking content of your presentation. We're willing to take questions for Louise, so if you can either raise your hand in the participants list in WebEx or shoot me something in the chat, that will work best. Okay, I can see Armel has a question here. So if Armel wants to hit *7 on his phone and chime in with his question, feel free.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Louise, thank you so much. This is super interesting. As you probably know, in services, we're constantly grasping at the best ways of communicating to our audience, varying obviously from EMO to public to media. And I just wondered if you had any comments on the what we used to call early notifications and now are called weather notifications, and if you've had a chance to see some of those, if you're on any of those distribution lists, and any comments would be well appreciated as we evolve with that product and how we use it, and it's just a really pertinent topic for us at the moment.
Yeah, well, I'm aware of those, and I've seen some of those bulletins, and we did not test them directly, but they would be actually a very good context to continue sort of that research, in that as well it adds the complexity of the ecology model, which means how do you communicate to your interested stakeholders to enable them to enable their own constituent base as well, and the timeline of that, so that the information that you have can be conveyed to them. And in establishing not only a communication that is a push, I think there are more interactions, but there's part that I think is not as interactive, in pushing the idea that communication is not just informing them of the early warnings, but learning what it creates for them in terms of vulnerabilities and in terms of the cost of some mitigation strategy, so that you would be in a better position to know the trade-off between the uncertainty you have to convey, but in advance enough so that they have time to prepare, or some pieces where you have to better describe the uncertainty because it's so costly for them or their own constituents. And so I think it's a great tool. I think it's in a context in which you seem to develop very good relationships. I think they could probably still be improved, and so that those conversations are as empowering for both sides of the table. But I think those seem to be great initiatives.
Right, yeah, very delicate balance to know exactly when, how much the confidence levels are good enough to actually communicate something. Agreed. No, that's good comments. Thank you.
Yeah. Because that relates to the idea that too often uncertainty has been conveyed as either an error, as not knowing, as an incompetence. And it's through the relationship, and it's linked to trust, that you change the meaning of uncertainty as being benevolence. I'm telling you in advance, I'm not sure, but I think from what we know of the configuration of forces, that there's a higher probability that this will occur. And so I think the overall discourse around uncertainty has to improve, because especially in North America and in the context of traditional science, it used to be that people who are competent are those who know. Especially in the medical field, it has been really pushed, whereas in the context of climate change, it's even more important that uncertainty is a form of knowledge as well, but it's knowledge and development, and it's enabling in development. And it's through the relationships that people sort of get the fact that you're saying it not out of incompetence, but out of caring. And that's the bit where I think we could improve overall as a government in transferring that message to our partners.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions out there. Again, I really want to appreciate and thank Louise for joining us today, and Miriam as well. So if there's any further questions after the presentation, her email is on the slide above. Feel free to contact her directly to ask questions. Other than that, thank you very much for joining us today, and a big shout out to Louise for doing a great job and joining us from the University of Ottawa. We appreciate it. So thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.